Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for Ranching 101. We're excited today to be joined by Dr. Lonnie Woolley-Luchek. Before we begin, we want to thank our sponsor, Lone Star Ag Credit, for their support of our program. At this time, we're going to show a brief video from our sponsor.
My name's Tony Ballinger, and me and my family own and operate Crossbeat Cattle Company. We'd be considered a first-generation ranching operation. You know, we kind of started from scratch and kind of built up over the years. Just me and my son, Carson. You know, the guys there at Lone Star, they do a good job of building a good relationship. It's more like dealing with a partner than it is a bank. And I think that's really important in the ag business.
So once again, thanks to our sponsor. As we transition into our program, we want to remind you all that registration for our summer meeting is still open. Please join us June 9th and 10th in Santa Fe, New Mexico. For more information and registration, please visit tscra.org. We will also be hosting Dr. Morgan and Brian Treadwell June 21st for Ranching 101. To register for that, visit tscra.org. This is just a reminder that you can send any questions that you have throughout the webinar. You can drop them in the chat or question and answer box below. At this time, it is our honor to introduce Dr. Lonnie Woolley-Luchek. Lonnie was raised on a small farm in Grandview, Texas. She joined the Department of Agricultural Sciences, West Texas A&M University family in January of 2020. She received a bachelor's in animal science, meat business from Texas Tech University in 2012, and a master's and doctorate in animal science meat science from Texas Tech University in 2014 and 2019, respectively. Dr. Luchek teaches food science, meat animal, and carcass evaluation, and advanced animal and meat evaluation. She coaches and mentors the meat judging, meat science quiz bowl, and meat animal evaluation teams at West Texas A&M. In addition to the competitive team, she serves as the advisor to the Block and Bridle Club. Dr. Luchek's research interests include meat and food science, specifically fresh meat quality. Lonnie and her husband Cody reside in Canyon with their new daughter Luca Jo, but enjoy raising Bringus show cattle out of Cody's home ranch in Poth, Texas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luchek. I think you're good to share your screen now, so.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. They said that we're going to mainly be talking kind of on a beginner level about beef carcass overview for the Ranching 101 series. And so we'll briefly discuss kind of a few things about maybe retaining ownership and some of those carcass characteristics that you might see from your cattle if you were to send them to the packing plant. And so I appreciate the introduction and appreciate your time today after the lunch hour. So you might be visiting with some of your other cattle ranching buddies, and you might be talking about some of your cattle, and the question might come up, so how'd they grade? And you might be saying, well, they were 80% choice or prime, which is great. Or you might not know anything about what choice or prime, or man, I had a 2% dark cutters or something like that. And so today we're mainly going to focus on some of those basic characteristics of beef carcasses that you might see whenever you send some of your cattle to the plant. So just in general, Overall, right now, we have about 94 million, almost 94 million cattle and calves in the United States. But primarily when we're talking about carcasses, we're primarily focused about cattle right before that stage and looking at cattle on feed. And so right now we have just shy of 15 million head of cattle on feed in the United States. And the majority of those cattle, about 81.4% of those cattle, are housed in large feedlots of over 1,000 head capacity. And so majority of those cattle are going to be in large feedlots, and a lot of them are located right here in the great state of Texas. And specifically where I reside here in West Texas in the Panhandle, we house a large amount of cattle on feed. And what that means is just an animal that's going to be on some kind of high concentrate ration that should grade select or higher is the definition of cattle on feed. And so the majority of those cattle are going to be in the South and Central Midwest. Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and Colorado are the top 5 states for cattle on feed in the United States. So many of you might be familiar with the National Beef Quality Audit, but as you can see, it happens approximately every 5 or so years. We're currently doing a National Beef Quality Audit right now. We had to postpone it a couple years due to COVID, but we'll talk a little bit about eating satisfaction today primarily. You can see that over time, we've changed some of the quality challenges that we've seen in our beef, and those rankings have changed over time. The total list has changed over time. You can see the last 2 quality audits, food safety ranked number 1 in terms of a quality challenge. We won't be focusing too much on food safety today, but that second bullet there, eating satisfaction, as well as some of that lean, fat, and bone, weight and size, and visual characteristics will be something that we discuss today in terms of a quality challenge that we see in the industry, and maybe some things that we can do to help that challenge. So we'll start by talking about which entity is it that is going to undertake inspecting as well as grading carcasses, and that is the United States Department of Agriculture. Within USDA, we have 2 other entities. Food Safety Inspection Service is going to be the service that inspects cattle as well as carcasses for wholesomeness or the ability to eat that animal, or is it safe to eat? Is it wholesome or fit to eat? And so that carcass will first be inspected by an inspector, and that's paid for by tax dollars and required. But only a portion of carcasses are actually graded, and that is chosen by the packer or processor, chosen marketing for those carcasses that they have to pay for. And so that is under the umbrella of the Agricultural Marketing Service under USDA. So many of the facts and figures and things like that you'll see here today were pulled from the AMS website. And so if you have any further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me afterwards or reach out and look at that website if you're wondering about any of the facts and figures that you see here today. So we'll briefly talk about some important carcass characteristics that we see in terms of relation to the live animal. So the first one that we're going to talk about is carcass size and carcass weight. Then we'll go into beef quality grading, beef yield grading, and then some different premiums and discounts that you might see your cattle receiving discounts or premiums at the rail. So if you retain ownership on your cattle, you're most likely marketing those cattle in some type of grid type value-based marketing. And so the traits that we're looking at in terms of the grid include hot carcass weight, quality grade, yield grade, and then some of these additional adjustments. So we'll go through each of these today, but you can see here on this grid, everything in black is considered average or par. Everything in red would receive a discount, and everything in green would receive a premium. So you can see that the average hot carcass weight is 600 to 900 pounds. The average quality grade or base quality grade would be low choice, and the base yield grade would be a yield grade 3. In terms of yield grade premiums, Yield grade 1s and 2s would get a premium. Yield grade 4s and 5s would get a discount. Quality grades, same thing. Prime and premium choice, which would be top choice, or those grades average and high choice, which are eligible for your box beef programs like certified Angus beef, would receive a premium, whereas select and standard would receive a discount. And then lights and heavies would also receive a discount. So first we'll talk about some of the carcass weight variation that we might see in the industry. So right now, 600 to 900 pounds is still the par hot carcass weight for cattle. However, I will say that we've had some discussions with some packers recently that have actually been discounting carcasses under 700 pounds. So this is changing, and this has changed over time. So why do we care about hot carcass weight? Why do we care about lightweights? Why do we care about heavyweights? Number one is we want a consistent product. So I'm going to jump over to the next screen just real quick so you can kind of see the difference that we can possibly see at the retail level. So we can see a very big difference in ribeye area here, a very big difference in marbling, and a huge difference in where they cut this steak from. So on the left, we have kind of a poor man's ribeye, or kind of a chuck end cut ribeye with lots of marbling, a little darker in color. And on the right, we have a very large ribeye steak with not much marbling. And so we want to do our best to avoid this. And so therefore, whenever we go to the grocery store, we expect when we go buy beef ribeye steaks, it should be just like when we go buy, certain type of apple or a certain type of banana. It should be the exact same every single time. And so that's what we're trying to do, is to provide a very consistent product to our consumers. So I'm going to go back to this slide. So on the left-hand side, lightweights. We want to be able to maximize our efficiency in carcasses, whether that be in terms of putting more meat or more fat on that carcass. And so we've done a lot of work in terms of using all the technologies at bay that we possibly can, increasing feed efficiency, giving that animal an implant, feeding a beta agonist, and those types of things to increase efficiency of carcass, increase carcass size, increase carcass weight, to maximize the amount of meat that comes from that carcass. So we don't want to turn out a bunch of 500-pound carcasses that don't maximize our efficiency, because ultimately we're probably not seeing that come through on our bottom line. On the other end of the scale, 900 to over 1,000-pound carcass, you can see those discounts are pretty low. A 900 to 1,000-pound carcass is only $1 discount per hundredweight, whereas over 1,000-pound carcass could be somewhere a $5 discount. Over 1,050 is a $16 discount. And so those carcass discounts have decreased because we're seeing more and more of our cattle reach that 900, 1,000, maybe even 1,100. I've seen numerous 1,200-pound carcasses in packing plants. And so as we still pay on the pound or by the pound, we're going to continue to see those weights increase. Some of the other things that we might attribute weight increases to is, we're feeding cattle longer. We're trying to get that prime premium, or maybe even a premium choice premium. So it might make sense to feed cattle longer into a heavier hot carcass weight. You might incur a $1 discount, but later you might see the prime premium or the premium choice premium will counteract that heavyweight discount. So we don't want heavyweight carcasses because a lot of our plants were built back when cattle were much smaller, in that 600-pound range. So many times I've seen these carcasses dragging the ground at different processing facilities. So one of the older processing packing plants that I've been to has had 3 men there standing there and having to saw off some of the neck so that it doesn't drag the ground. And so they've figured out that, I guess, 3 people's worth of labor is better than saying, okay, we can't take any more big carcasses. And so also, whenever you get a bunch of those heavyweight carcasses on some of those older rails, you can have whole rails fall in the plant, which is a really bad day to be working in the sales cooler at one of those plants. So there's some pros and cons to the bigger cattle, but you can understand hopefully why the industry has had an increase in carcass weight over time, which is kind of what this chart here shows, is that over time, every year, we see steers and heifers increase in hot carcass weight. We see steers increase about 5 pounds a year and heifers increase about 6 pounds a year. And this trend is not changing. We continue to see this, and we think it's going to continue to rise. So we're going to keep having heavier cattle, and bigger cut sizes. Now, one thing that I haven't talked about yet in terms of larger carcasses is the cut size, and probably one of the most important to the consumer, as well as the retailer, as well as the food service or chef. So what happens whenever you go and cut a 10-ounce ribeye or a 12-ounce ribeye or a 16-ounce ribeye from a 19-inch ribeye, a really, really large ribeye? Well, it therefore then becomes very thin, and no one wants to eat a thin ribeye steak. So we've said, okay, well, if we continue getting cattle bigger and continue getting ribeye size bigger, we're going to need to do something to cut the product different, especially the middle meats, different, in order to still have a thick steak that's tender and juicy for the consumer. And so there's been some alternative steak cutting methods where we can take the spinalis off the ribeye roll, or maybe longitudinally cut that strip loin in half and have a fillet of strip, a smaller serving size, but still a thicker portion. But overall, these cutting methods haven't been very widely accepted among the consumer. And so they haven't been widely adopted at any of the retail space or the food service space. So in addition to just overall weight of the cattle or of the carcass, some of that may happen indirectly by bruises or trim loss at the plant. And this is not something, unfortunately, that the cattle producer can usually prevent, because a lot of this is going to happen later in life, maybe en route to the plant, maybe right before the plant. And so if you have a carcass with a bruise, that portion of the tissue would have to be trimmed or cut out. And so you're going to have an indirect discount. It's not necessarily discounted, but you're going to have a loss in hot carcass weight, therefore a loss in dressing percent, and therefore an indirect loss in terms of price of that carcass. Some of these bruises can be caused by cattle handling. Most of the time, we can see some of the bruises on some of the sirloin, maybe from maybe the trucks, especially in larger dairy type cattle or something. Maybe they're rubbing up against the top of the truck, maybe they're too big, and that can cause a bruise. If you have cattle with horns, that's why dehorning is very important, because we don't want cattle to beat each other up with their horns and then cause these bruises, because that's a huge deduction at the plant. We recently here in West Texas, Hereford, 30 minutes down the road, had a large hailstorm a couple weeks ago. And I was at a packing plant and they said, hey, how long does it take before we should take these cattle? Because we brought a load in a few days after the hailstorm, and they're just covered in little golf ball to baseball size bruises that they had to trim off and completely lose that product. And that product basically turned into number 2 product because of the hailstorm. And so really that can take somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks to recover that tissue before you send that animal to the plant. So unfortunately for the cattle producer, this may come at a loss, whether you like it or not, just based on some of the handling that happens that's maybe out of your control. So now we're going to dip our toes into quality and yield grading. We're going to talk about quality grades first and then yield grades. So quality grades are predicting palatability, or the tenderness, juiciness, and flavor of that cooked product. So how does it taste? Whereas yield grades predict cutability, or the portion of carcass and boneless closely trimmed retail cuts. So the proportion of muscle compared to the proportion of fat and bone. So we'll start by just going over the list here. Quality grades, prime, choice, select, and standard are kind of the 4 main quality grades that you've probably heard of, whereas commercial, utility, and canner and cutter are kind of the older cattle quality grades. And then yield grades, we'll talk about yield grades 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 1 being the best and 5 being the worst. So when we talk about quality grading, the first thing that usually comes to mind is marbling, and really probably the most important. It's a subjective evaluation of the quantity of intramuscular fat or marbling in the longissimus muscle or loini or ribeye muscle between the 12th and 13th ribs. So the boxes in the black are the national average for the percentage of cattle that grade prime, premium choice, choice, select, and no roll. And then I have the little Texas there to show where Texas fits. So you can see right now, the national average for prime is about 9.88%, which is great. And we've seen that increase over the last 10 years to about that 10% range. And so overall, props to the cattle raisers for selecting and using probably genetic selection as well as some of the cattle feeding maybe, but genetic selection has really improved so that we can have a higher percentage of prime carcasses. However, on the Texas side of things, we're a little bit lower at that 3.23%. So we might see more of those prime carcasses coming out of the Midwest versus Texas. In terms of choice, we're about 72%. And if you break that down further to premium choice and choice. So premium choice would be upper 2/3 choice, which is average and high choice. We're a little over 30%. Commodity choice or just regular low choice is about 40%. So the majority of cattle are grading choice. Then on a national average, select and no roll, select is about 14% and no roll is about 3%. So you can see on the Texas side of things, we're predominantly choice. We have almost 30% select, and we don't have many no roll cattle, which is great. And so for those of you that may not be familiar with the word no roll is basically whenever they used to grade the carcasses back in the day, they would take the stamp and it would be on a roller, and they would roll the whole carcass with a stamp that said USDA select or USDA choice or USDA prime. If it didn't meet a grade and it was ungraded, it wouldn't get to roll the stamp up and down. And so we would call it a no roll. So USDA standards, as well as some of these other carcasses that we'll talk about today, dark cutters, blood splash, things like that would fall under the grade of no roll. And approximately 71% of our cattle are black hided or potentially eligible for some type of certified Angus beef program, something like that. We also look at maturity when we do quality grading. So one of the things that we'll talk about is dentition. So we're getting there, but historically, we've only evaluated maturity as in terms of ossification of the thoracic buttons of the vertebrae. And so we've looked at the vertebral column and said, are these young or old cattle based on physiological maturity? So the majority of the fed cattle are going to be A maturity, meaning they're very young, less than 30 months of age. And then there's a small percentage after that that could be older. So B, C, D, and E. E would be, over 96 months of age. D is going to be somewhere between 72 to 96 months of age. So we're talking much older cattle. So most of the young cattle that we're feeding in the US are going to be in that A and maybe B maturity level. So in terms of where we're looking, we're mainly looking at that vertebral column. We're looking at the thoracic buttons, but we'll also take into account the lumbar and sacral thoracic buttons. And so what's happening there is basically whenever you went to the doctor at a young age, maybe 13 or 14 years old, and the doctor said, sorry, Lonnie, you're not going to be playing at the WNBA, you're just going to have to be a meat scientist now. The reason they knew that is because my growth plate in my long bone, say my femur, had ossified. And so I had reached maturity, and therefore my bone was no longer had cartilage there, could turn over into long bone growth. Same thing happens in cattle. As that animal reaches maturity, that button or cartilage begins to ossify. And so we'll see an increase in ossification as that animal gets older. And a few other things can affect that as well that we'll talk about. We also look at lean color whenever we talk about maturity. A maturity carcasses are going to have a bright cherry red or even a light red color. And as that animal gets older, they're going to increase in the amount of myoglobin or the amount of pigment that causes the red meat color in that muscle. And so this is very, very important because the majority of consumers rank color as the number one factor that they're looking at when evaluating whether to purchase a fresh beef steak. So above marbling, above price, above any of the growth promoting implant or growth promoting factors, anything like that, color ranks number one in multiple of the studies that I've done in terms of what consumers are looking for. And so that's why color is very, very important that we evaluate. So overall, we use the maturity at the top, A, B, C, D, and E, as well as the marbling on the left-hand side, whether to determine whether the quality grade is prime, choice, select, standard, or if it's an older animal, it would fall under that commercial or utility grade. However, in 2017, there was a change to our grading standards and we started incorporating dentition. And so basically we came up with a better way of evaluating maturity using dentition versus ossification. So if we look at the dentition or the teeth of that animal and it says it's less than 30 months, then that animal would be considered a maturity unless it has over about 70% ossification. So if it's D or E maturity, then it would be considered old. But otherwise, as long as it's less than 30 months by teeth and has less than 70% ossification, it's just a maturity, and all we have to evaluate is marbling. It's important that we use dentition because heifers used to be at risk for maybe getting into that B and possibly C maturity, because heifers, as well as maybe uncut bulls or late cut bulls, would have more estrogen or more testosterone in their system, causing them to ossify quicker and therefore maybe getting a discount at the plant due to some ossification issues. But now we've hopefully overcome that with the new dentition rule. If they have more than 3 permanent incisors, then that animal will be considered over 30 months. And then we have to use the old method of looking at the maturity of the ossification in the buttons, as well as the color and the marbling score to determine the overall quality grade. So you can see here that how we evaluate dentition would be at the plant. We're going to look at their permanent incisors. If they have 2 teeth, we're good, less than 30 months. As soon as they have the eruption of the 3rd permanent incisor or the 2nd set of permanent incisor, they're considered over 30 months, and then they would receive a discount, which we will discuss. So what's the purpose of grading? Obviously, we know that prime we can sell for a higher premium. So who are we targeting? We're targeting hotels, restaurants, white tablecloth restaurants. We're not seeing a ton of prime at retail, but there are starting to be more retailers that have maybe a prime ribeye roll or strip in the case for those consumers that are wanting it. Choice and select are going to be mainly targeted towards your retail consumers, and then commercial utility, as well as some of those older cows are going to be ground beef, comminuted or prepared beef items, so maybe fully cooked items, as well as maybe targeted more towards food service, because those animals, although the meat may taste fine, it might be a little bit darker in color, might be from an older animal. And so we can use it on the food service side, say at Golden Corral or something like that, on $9.99 steak night. And although it may taste okay, it may not look pretty in the package, so we can use it on the food service side. So now that we've talked about quality grading, we'll switch gears and visit a little bit about yield grading. So what goes into a yield grade? There's 4 things: fat thickness, or we also call this preliminary yield grade; ribeye area, which we're going to measure at the cross-sectional area of the longissimus muscle or the ribeye area; hot carcass weight; and then estimated percentage of kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. So here at the bottom, you can see the breakdown of the percentage of yield grades in the US currently. The majority of carcasses grade yield grade 3 at 50.6%, 29.6% grade yield grade 2. And then we've seen a slight increase in the amount of yield grade 4s and a few extra yield grade 5s, but predominantly an increase in yield grade 4s. Again, this goes back to we're feeding cattle longer, we're feeding cattle heavier, and as you increase in weight, sometimes that also hurts the yield grade. So we're going to measure the fat thickness 3/4 up the distance of the ribeye, and that's going to tell us about how much back fat or external fat that animal has deposited. And overall, our goal as producers is to ideally produce a lot of prime yield grade ones. So we want the most marbling with the least amount of back fat. But if you've raised beef cattle, you know that that's not always true. And as cattle put on more fat externally, then they put on marbling, and it kind of happens in that order, unless you're looking at certain genetics, maybe Akaushi. And so as you increase the amount of back fat, most likely you're going to have an increase in marbling. But ideally, you would like to have the increase in marbling without the increase of back fat. Then we're going to measure the ribeye area. So you can see this person here is measuring with the ribeye dot grid. We're measuring it in square inches. This doesn't normally happen at the plant. Normally, we're going to use a camera that's going to measure these for us. So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to estimate kidney, pelvic, and heart fat in relation to the body weight of that carcass. And so sometimes this is done, and sometimes this is actually just valued in, factored in the computer due to the fact that a lot of these plants are pulling this kidney, pelvic, and heart fat on the kill floor. So what are we estimating? We're estimating the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed rib, loin, chuck, and round cuts. There was a linear regression equation that was developed a long time ago, only from 162 head that this is based off of. And so the yield grade equation was developed to estimate percentage boneless, closely trimmed round, loin, rib, and chuck cuts. And you can see a yield grade 1 has about 52.3% boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, whereas a yield grade 5 is going to have less than 45% of that carcass is going to turn into retail cuts that you can actually consume. So I like these pictures, although they're a little bit dated. They're really, really neat in order to see the difference in yield grade 2 as well as yield grade 5. So you can see we've got kind of a Charolais looking growthier, probably a yield grade 2 heavy muscled trim animal here. And then we've got the bisections of that carcass at the top. So you can see we don't have a whole lot of cod fat, not a lot of back fat, and definitely not much brisket throughout. And you can see overall it was about 66% lean, which is really high, and only 18% fat. Then we move over here to our little short, dumpy, fat Angus, and we have a yield grade 5, pretty extreme yield grade 5, with tons of back fat, quite a bit of cod fat, and then a ton of brisket here. So if I just kind of jump back and forth, you can see the difference between a yield grade 2 animal and a yield grade 5 animal. So hopefully we never get to that point, but we're looking at a huge deduction in terms of percent lean. So we had a 66% lean in the yield grade 2 and only 43% lean in the yield grade 5. So a lot smaller proportion of that animal is going to be able to be sold as retail product. So I mentioned that a lot of this happens by a use of a camera. And so many plants use this beef grading camera, where it takes an image of both sides of the carcass and takes those images. There is a USDA grader standing there that can override it if they think the marbling is 20 degrees higher or lower than what the camera calls. But overall, that grader is also standing there to check over 30 months, to check ossification and anything if the camera doesn't catch something, and to assign those quality grades. So in just a little bit of brief history about where we've come from and where we are now, I think it's important to note that we've done a really good job in terms of genetic selection recently. But as you can see, back in the 50s, we were selecting for those old school, what I call old school Herefords or old school Angus type, short, very fat, probably pretty light muscled. And that's what we were shooting for. And that was the gold standard. Then we completely switched gears and said, no, we don't need to select for that. We need to go the opposite way. We need to select for larger frame size cattle, growthier cattle, higher cutability cattle. And so then we end up here in the 70s with this kind of yield grade 1 looking growthy animal. And I think now you can see that we've kind of met in the middle and become a little bit more moderate in our frame size. Still have enough fat to hopefully grade choice and maybe even premium choice, but still have that grow to be able to be a yield grade 1 or 2, hopefully at the same time. So I think we've done a good job in terms of genetic selection to be where we're at currently. So now we'll visit briefly about some carcass discounts that you might see at the plant. So here's a list of possible discounts. So we've already visited at the bottom about lightweights, heavyweights, yield grade 4s and 5s, no rolls and over 30 months of age. And so we'll see some more examples of those, but dairy type, hard bone, dark cutters, bullocks, and stags would receive very hefty discounts. And this is $1 per hundredweight. So you can calculate that out for, say 1,000-pound carcass adds up very, very quickly. We're looking at $300, $350 and a carcass. So a large discount. So we mentioned over 30 months, we're looking at the teeth. And so you can see we've got young cattle here. As soon as we hit that second set of permanent incisors or the third permanent incisor, that animal is going to be considered over 30 months. And the SRMs or specified risk materials, the brain, spinal cord, things like that will have to be removed from the food supply. And those carcasses cannot be sold as a bone-in product. It must be a boneless product so that we don't have that vertebral column attached to that carcass. This receives a pretty heavy discount, and anything over 30 months likely will not be able to be used for export as well because of the risk with BSE. USDA Select would receive a discount to about $13 per hundredweight. USDA Standard or no roll would receive a discount about $30 per hundredweight. So you can see these have virtually no marbling. Hopefully we're not producing cattle that look like this, that are really heavy muscled, really, really trim and have no marbling. But as you saw, we do have a small percentage, anywhere from 1 to about 3%, depending on where you're at, that end up as no roll carcasses. And then yield grade 4s and 5s. These are going to be those fatter cattle, maybe a little bit lighter muscled. Yield grade 4s are going to receive an $11 discount, and yield grade 5s about a $16 discount. We also receive discounts for dairy type carcasses. So dairy type carcasses are going to be very angular in terms of its ribeye shape, as well as angular in terms of its round and overall muscle structure. So in terms of its meat to bone ratio, it has a much lower meat or muscle to bone ratio. So it's usually about 3.1 to 1 versus a beef type animal would be about 4.1 to 1 in terms of its muscle to bone ratio. So this would receive a small discount. Hard bones are those animals that have advanced maturity, the D+ maturity, which I mentioned is about 70% ossified. So this is not even a D yet, but they're going to be pretty ossified in those cartilaginous buttons for it to be considered a hard bone. And that would receive almost a $35 per hundredweight discount. Dark cutters are something that really come into play a lot of times here in the Texas Panhandle. And dark cutters are due to the fact of or due to long-term stress. And so if this animal has undergone some type of stress, whether that be physiological stress, nutritional stress, maybe some stress due to the weather, which I mentioned, we had a hailstorm, and most likely probably in the next week or two, more plants in the area are probably going to see a higher rate of dark cutting beef. As well as whenever you have a few days that are freezing cold and then the next day it's 90 degrees outside, that very drastic change in temperature is going to stress that animal. And so what happens with dark cutting is that they stress out so much that they've used up all the energy reserves in the muscle, all of the glycogen in the muscle. So then there's no energy to then be converted to lactic acid upon slaughter. And so whenever there's no energy to convert to lactic acid, the pH remains high. If there is energy to be converted to lactic acid, then the pH will have a normal drop from about 7.4 to about 5.6. If there's nothing to drop the pH, then that pH remains high. Therefore, you get this really dark color, firm to the touch and very dry to the touch. And it holds a lot of water. And ultimately, at that point, there's not much we can do. Blood splash is another one that may be caused by either severe stress right before slaughter or maybe a long stun to stick time. So if we wait a long time before we stick or bleed the animal after we stun the animal, then you could end up with blood splash. It could also happen pre-slaughter as well. But most of the time what happens here is just these capillaries rupture, and therefore you get some little hemorrhages in the meat. And therefore we call it blood splash, or scientifically we call it ecchymiosis. And then calloused ribeye. I don't know if anyone has ever seen one of these before, but what happens is if there's some type of severe trauma to that part of the muscle, then it will infiltrate with fat afterwards during its healing. And so a lot of times we would see this if anyone gives an intramuscular injection in the loin eye or ribeye, which is a big no-no because of this, as well as even in the round, then you would see some of this calloused eye. So you can see the picture on the right, that eye is completely calloused. A lot of times you'll just see little portions of the ribeye that is calloused. And sometimes we can't see this until it even gets to the food service person or the retailer, and they cut the steaks and it's in the middle of the ribeye roll. And so sometimes that gets hit on the plant, and they might be able to trace it back to a lot or something, but most of the time they won't be able to trace it back to you specifically. So a bullock or a stag carcass is going to be a really heavy muscled animal that was likely cut after it was already showing secondary sex characteristics of a bull. And so most likely this animal is never going to grade choice. And so it's going to receive a discount at the plant because it's so heavy muscled that it doesn't have the propensity to grade or marble. And although yellow fat and hump height don't receive direct discounts, they do receive, or they are located on the list of things to look for whenever we're looking at boxed beef programs like certified Angus beef. We don't want yellow fat and we don't want hump height. Yellow fat would be that from an animal that's been grass fed or grass finished because of the production of beta carotene. And then a hump height would be bigger for those Bos Indicus or American breeds of cattle. So you can see here, certified Angus beef has to be at least choice or better, modest or higher in its marbling. And then down here, we want a 10 to 16 inch ribeye. We're allowing up to a 19-inch ribeye on certain portions of the carcass, but usually not middle meats. Over 1050 in terms of its carcass weight. That used to be 1,000, then we upped it to 1050 because of the increase in carcass size. And then you can see free of dart cutting and a max hump height of less than 2 inches. So just to briefly go over some carcass premiums, we've got all natural that receives a pretty large premium that is a lot of just marketing. So if you can market your cattle as all natural, there's typically no restriction on feed. The nature source there says it's finished on natural corn. And so it's likely corn fed or high concentrate fed cattle. Antibiotic use may or may not be allowed. Growth promoting use may or may not be allowed. Usually has to be certified or have a producer signed affidavit. So this is a way to market your cattle in a very easy way, as long as you can work with those certification programs. Non-hormone treated cattle, or NHTC, basically we're going to use modern technology with the exception of growth promoting implants to efficiently convert feed, labor, and environmental resources into high quality protein. Not using a growth promoting implant is going to probably cost us a little bit as well in terms of efficiency. So it might be kind of a muted efficiency that we might get a premium for it being NHTC, but if we just used implants, we might see just about an equal premium on that side. Then we also have premiums for USDA prime carcasses, $14 per hundredweight premium. Premium choice gives us a $4 premium. Yield grade 1 and 2, much smaller premiums, if you notice, compared to quality grades. So quality grades are much more important to shoot for with your cattle versus trying to hit yield grade 1 or 2 because the premium is just not there. So overall, if we kind of look at the total premiums and discounts that we could get from our cattle, we are seeing, as I said, more cattle grade prime, which is awesome. But we are also seeing an increase in yield grade fours. But you might say, well, I'll take that $11 discount as long as I know my cattle are going to hit prime, because overall I still have a total net production or a total net premium of $3. And so that's worth it to a lot of people that are doing this on a larger scale. Is it's okay if my cattle are a little bit heavier, they get a $1 discount. It's okay if they reach yield grade 4, they might get a $10 or $11 discount, as long as I can hit that prime premium. And these change over time throughout the year. So it's important to note that this, fluctuates over time. Right now we're entering grilling season. And so June and July tend to be a higher choice select spread. So marketing those cattle that are going to grade to choice or prime in the summer is very important as well. And then we'll see a decline after that. So it's important to just watch the markets and see where these cattle are falling in terms of your premiums and discounts. So when we sell on the grid, each carcass is sold on a carcass weight basis. Each carcass is sold individually. We'll look at every quality grade, which may result in a premium or discount. We'll look at every yield grade, which could result in a premium or discount. And then carcass weight discounts may be imposed, as well as other discounts that may or may not have something to do with how you raise that calf. So unknown cattle are difficult to predict. So technically, you probably shouldn't sell on a grid unless you know kind of how your cattle perform at the plant. And the producer pays for poor workmanship by the packer. So if there is excessive trim loss, that could be poor workmanship by the packer, or it could also be poor handling up to the point where it got to the packer. And then the producer also pays for improper handling, bruises and dark cutters. So that could be handling, but it also, again, could be a weather stress event that you had your cattle in the feedlot. We had this hailstorm, and then you took them to the plant because they were marketed or ready to go that next week. And they incurred a bunch of number 2 product because they had to do a lot of trimming on those carcasses. So those are some pros and cons about selling on the grid. And I think with that, I will start taking any questions. So if you have any questions and you don't want to reach out on the chat, feel free to email me. I try to keep this very basic and short and sweet for kind of the beginner rancher, that you can learn a little bit more about overall attributes of the carcass that we're looking for at the plant. So I will take any questions at this point.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A box.
Okay.
What is the chance of bringing back ranch to rail?
Ranch to rail, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. If you could provide me a little bit more clarification. Okay, I've got a few questions coming in here. I will never be able to see the grade of the meat I produce as a small producer that sells to local auctions. How can I improve my dollars per pound? So I'm assuming you're talking about feeder cattle as a small producer selling to a local auction. In terms of feeder cattle, we don't want them too fleshy. We want muscle scores of 1s and 2s predominantly, so definitely no dairy influence, anything like that. And so mainly just looking at the cattle that you're bringing to the auction. Are they the right? A lot of times they might look at a hide color as well, so sometimes they'll want black-hided cattle. But in terms of a feeder cattle premium, hitting the right weight range, that 600-pound weight range or something like that, not too heavy, not too light, and things like that are kind of the main factors. What do you think the production ramifications of the focus on grade have been? Well, I don't know that there's many ramifications, if we call it that, but I think overall it's been great to increase overall quality grade, to have a higher percentage of choice and prime. When I was talking with my husband and saying that, we're 70% choice and 10% prime, he almost couldn't believe it. And so I think that overall we've done a good job shifting to that, but some of the ramifications are we're producing bigger cattle, we're producing fatter cattle, and therefore we're probably resulting in a little bit more loss in terms of yield, but the plant hasn't been complaining too much about that. How will trailer load and travel to processing facility impact the quality of the meat? So I kind of mentioned this a few times, but if you have a long period of time to travel to the processing plant, you can possibly increase the stress of that animal. And therefore you might have a higher incidence of dark cutters, trailer load as well. So if you're putting too many cattle in that load, then you could have a lot more bruises. And so therefore you're going to potentially incur some discounts on the rail because of a higher incidence of bruises, because those cattle were bumping up against each other, especially horns. That's another thing on feeder cattle. We don't want any horns or uncut bulls or anything like that. I have never castrated my bull calves selling at a local auction. How much am I losing by not taking this step, selling at 6 months? I would have to look at the price breakdown. I can get back to you exactly how much you're losing, but usually I believe it's at least, I'll have to double check what it is currently, but I will get back to you, Ken, on how much you're losing on not castrating, but castrating is very important. Okay, someone said, I didn't see any discounts for longhorn cattle called out in your presentation, but I've seen them significantly docked when marketed as stockers and feeders. Is there a reason they're typically discounted, mainly attributed to carcass characteristics? So longhorn cattle, number one, horns. Number two are usually the genetic, they don't have the genetic propensity to grow. They don't have the genetic propensity to grade usually. And so they're going to most often get discounted because of those three things. The genetics just aren't there to grade choice or to reach a high enough dressing percent to make it worth feeding those cattle. Find a couple more. So on average, how long will cattle remain in a feedlot environment before going to processing? This can definitely vary. It could be 120 days, could be 280 days, could be 300 days. But normally we're gonna expect somewhere in that 200 to 280 day range in there. I don't want to give you an exact day because it does vary, but they will be on feed for a good portion of a year.
So we had a clarification on the ranch to rail. He says we retained ownership and sent to feedlot with oversight by either Texas A&M or Texas Tech, and then were sold on rail. Dr. Smith is more familiar with the old program 20 plus years ago. Then those of us as being raised were only interested in raising a 5 weight to 8 weight calf with no concern for our product quality. Now, some of us old guys are using Wagyu on Brangus or Angus just for improvement.
Yes, so I think that's an important part that I was talking about, retaining ownership. If you do have those genetics and if you are able to know, like you said, how your cattle grade at the end of that feeding period, then you are able to capture a premium at the rail because of maybe your Wagyu genetics or something like that. But if you are just kind of shooting for, one of the 5 weight, 6 weights type of feeder calf, then maybe your priorities might be a little bit different because you're not necessarily seeing these premiums or discounts unless you're retaining that ownership and going from ranch to rail. Okay, what is the average yield rate of box beef compared to hanging weight? Understand it's about 62.5%. Is that what we are referring to as the hog carcass weight? So 62.5%, if you're seeing that percentage thrown around, that is your average dressing percent for cattle. And actually it's more like 63.5% or so. Especially steers are going to dress a little bit higher than heifers. And so dressing percent is what is the proportion of that live animal that is the carcass. And that is everything whenever it comes to selling fed cattle to the plant. And so if we can increase dress, if we can increase weight of the carcass, then ultimately that's going to increase our bottom line if we're selling by the pound. If we're retaining ownership and selling on the grid, yes, we need to increase dress, we need to increase weight, but not too heavy. And we need to shoot for those prime and premium choice premiums. So 62.5% of what you're referring to is considered dressing percent of the live weight, and then the dressing percent of the live weight that is the carcass. So we call that 62.5%, 63.5%. And then whenever we talk about carcass yield, that's whenever I was talking about yield grade, and that's going to be somewhere in between that, 45 to about 55% of that carcass may actually end up as retail cuts that then goes to the grocery store. I think that's all the questions on my end.
I believe that's about all we have in the Q&A too. So thank you, Dr. Luchek, again for taking time out of your day and joining us. And thank you to all the participants for joining us. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact us at education@tsra.org. And we will see you next time.
Thank you.